joined here by Hassan El-Tayyab, who is the lead Mideast lobbyist for the Friends Committee on National Legislation. Hassan, welcome to the conversation.
Hey, thanks so much for having me, Ryan.
So let me start by getting your reaction to President Joe Biden's first kind of foreign policy declaration that he was going to end, quote unquote, support for offensive operations in the war in Yemen. What's the reaction been to that, and what did you take from that announcement?
Great question. So, one, I would say this is the result of years and years of advocacy from the grassroots led by Yemeni Americans around the country, faith leaders, you know, just grassroots all over. And I think it's a tremendous win in the power of what advocacy can do if you sustain it over time and force members of Congress to take hard votes on things like Yemen war powers and resolutions of disapproval to block weapon sales to Saudi Arabia and the UAE. We may not have been able to pass it through the Trump administration, but it brought us to this moment. So I think it's really significant. But it also, there are a bunch of remaining questions that we have. What does offensive operations actually mean? Will this include U.S. support, if any, for the blockade on Yemen? Will this include spare parts transfers? So there's some remaining questions. We also don't know exactly what defensive means and what the original pretext for us being involved in the war in Yemen was a defensive move by the Obama administration. So there's some remaining questions that have to be answered. And we're working with members of Congress and other NGOs to try to get clarity right now. And that's what's needed.
Right. There hasn't really been a war that one side has called offensive basically since World War II, which is, if I recall correctly, that's right around the time that we changed the name of the War Department to the Defense Department. That was kind of the signal that we were about to become an empire. So you're right that you can't really draw a whole lot from defense and offense. But is that being too cynical? I mean, how is the announcement being received in the region?
Yeah, so I can speak for myself. I'm cautiously optimistic. I think we've moved the Democratic Party, we've moved Republicans as well, and the conversations I'm having on the Hill right now are way different than the conversations I was having 4 years ago. That's significant. The chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, is been consistently putting things out there like joint resolutions of disapproval to block the Saudi weapon sales. So again, just the conversations we're having are just way different. And that's putting us in a good place. I think there's a lot of skepticism in Yemen right now. They say, okay, well, what does this actually mean? The, airstrikes are still occurring. There were airstrikes this week. So, support for the war doesn't necessarily mean an end to the war. And we also have to restore humanitarian aid. We have to bring an end to the blockade, find a peaceful settlement, a ceasefire negotiation. So much really remains. But these are really critical initial steps that I'm cautiously optimistic about.
You're also seeing the UN raise an alarm about a recent Houthi offensive that they're saying could exacerbate the humanitarian crisis. Do you think this Houthi offensive is somehow connected to Biden's announcement, them seeing like, well, maybe this is ending soon, so we need to gobble up as much territory as possible so that we're in a stronger position at the negotiating table? Or do you think that those are disconnected and that this offensive was coming anyway?
Well, this offensive has been going on for about a year. So I see that in the context of, it's been a long time coming. The Houthis have been trying to take Marib, this oil-rich governorate in Yemen, which is a key stronghold for Hadi and the UN recognized government in Yemen. So I think, but the fact that it's coming so close to this announcement obviously gives you pause. I think it's a tragedy to see any Yemenis being killed by whether it's the Saudi UAE-led coalition or being done by Ansar Allah, aka the Houthis. And that's why we're doing so much work to try to work through the UN and support UN-led peace negotiations so we can bring an end to this conflict.
How does that happen? Like what are the next steps that are going to potentially actually bring this to an end?
Yeah, a really important question. So there's only so much the U.S. can do, but there's still a lot more we can do. One thing that I think is really critical in this short window of time between now and March 1, where the UN is hosting another donor summit to try to, restore and expand humanitarian funding to Yemen, is that we need to end our suspension, our USAID suspension of humanitarian aid that started in March under the Trump administration. So that's one. That's a huge advocacy push right now, and folks can let their members know and their senators know that we want to see aid restored and expanded to all parts of Yemen. We need to get Tim Lenderking and members of Congress to publicly call out the Saudi UAE blockade on Yemen, which has cut off the flow of food, fuel, and medicine, and which is really perpetuating the world's worst humanitarian crisis. Right now, there are 16 million people on the brink of famine. The UN is claiming that we've got 2 million children living, basically, if things don't change, you're going to see malnutrition and possible death of so many kids in Yemen. So that's also key. Last point I'll make is that we also need a robust peace process through the UN. And I think that's going to require a new UN Security Council resolution that's not just so focused on the Houthis, but also focused on all warring parties and trying to call for a nationwide ceasefire, an end to the blockade, an end to humanitarian obstruction of all kinds, and for the entire international community to stop selling weapons and providing military support for any warring party in Yemen.
So, speaking of those warring parties, in 2019, United Arab Emirates announced that they were kind of withdrawing troops from the war, but there's no real evidence that they've kind of stopped support of the war in a variety of different ways. How does the new relationship between Saudi Arabia and the UAE, the ostensible allies on here, who are now kind of at loggerheads over the issue of Qatar and some other strategic questions. How does the friction between those two play into how this is going to unfold?
That's a good question. It sort of remains to be seen in some ways. You had the Riyadh agreement that sort of brokered a settlement between the Southern Transitional Council, which are backed by the UAE, and the Hadi government, which is backed by Saudis. At one point in the war, they were both using U.S.-made weapons to kill each other, which it's kind of that I've heard people say that Yemen is where coalitions, go to get broken apart. And so like I said, I think it remains to be seen. We're focused really on the UN-led negotiations. I think it's really critical that we get that new Security Council resolution and that we work with Martin Griffiths to do everything we can to support a ceasefire by all parties and a negotiated settlement that not just includes the warring parties, but includes all parts of Yemeni society. We got to make sure that civil society and women and girls are also at the table when these talks are happening.
You also recently had these reports in The Intercept about the meeting between UAE Ambassador Yusuf El-Tayyab and Representative Ro Khanna, who was a lead sponsor of the Yemen War Powers resolution, in which Khanna said that El-Tayyab raised his voice at him, yelled at him during the meeting. El-Tayyab has denied that and has since invited Khanna onto his own podcast to bridge their differences. Khanna has said he will go on, but only if the UAE can force the release of Adel al-Hassani, a journalist, political prisoner held in Yemen. What did you make of that kind of diplomatic dust up between Khanna and El-Tayyab?
It was really unfortunate if the reports are true, and I have no reason to doubt Representative Ro Khanna. He's a person of great integrity, and he's done so much to end U.S. support for the Saudi UAE-led war in Yemen. So, I tend to, believe Ro Khanna is a trusted ally in the peace movement here. And it's really unconscionable that anybody would talk to a member of Congress like that, especially an ambassador from the United Arab Emirates. I think it shows a certain amount of decadence. And I think it's really unfortunate. I think the way Rep. Khanna handled it was, by saying that, yes, I'll potentially go on your podcast if you release this journalist. I think was pretty savvy on his part, and It remains to be seen what's going to ultimately happen. But at the end of the day, the UAE has been a major party to the war in Yemen. They've perpetuated violence. They've transferred U.S. weapons to Al-Qaeda affiliates on the ground in Yemen. They've run secret prisons and torture sites. They have plans to annex and occupy parts of southern Yemen. And, they've been supporting airstrikes as well. So it's really important that we do everything we can to hold them accountable and cut off support for their war in Yemen.
Right. Hassan El-Tayyab, thank you so much for joining us here on the conversation.
Thank you so much, Ryan. I really appreciate the Young Turks for all the great journalism over the years and giving activists like myself and others a voice in this.
Thanks for watching the Young Turks. I really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.